The scene switches to Edward and Lucas traveling together. They went to the doctor who said everything was fine. Sometimes Lucas would hug, kiss, and satisfy Edward, but going further was impossible. Edward couldn't control his overthinking that maybe Lucas still hadn't accepted him and was just pretending. Edward feared this was just a dream and he'd wake up finding it wasn't real. Unconsciously, their journey had reached the final stop, the gourmet planet. Edward had never seen grilled meat before, so now he looked at it longingly. His eyes lit up, telling Lucas he wanted to try it, but Lucas refused, saying it wasn't healthy, saddening Edward. Noticing this, Lucas quickly said he'd take Edward to eat something even more delicious than grilled meat. Like a little cat, Edward happily swung his tail. Lucas looked at him endearingly. Edward was very cute now. Edward excitedly awaited, and it turned out Lucas had brought him to a hot pot restaurant. Lately, Lucas had been very strict about not letting Edward eat spicy food, though Edward really craved it. He begged Lucas to let him eat just one skewer of grilled meat. Lucas asked if his heavier tastes would agree. Edward kept begging Lucas like a little puppy and finally got permission, overjoyed. Lucas truly cared about Edward's health rather than pretending. A server came over asking if Edward wanted to buy any movies. His shop had all kinds of genres from various planets, making Edward spit his drink in surprise. Embarrassed, Edward asked for details, so the man shamelessly displayed all kinds of discs. He winked at Edward, saying the prices were very cheap. Edward looked back at Lucas, who was buying skewers, face red as he asked the seller how to project the discs and if a bright screen could play them. The man launched into an advertisement about his premium discs. Edward worried Lucas might not want to watch them. The seller said with Edward's beauty, how could his partner refuse him? Edward just needed some tricks to get Lucas drunk, then play a disc, and Edward bashfully agreed to buy one in embarrassment. Lucas finished buying and came back asking what was going on. Edward poured some wine, saying drinking suited the atmosphere. Lucas immediately said Edward couldn't drink wine. Edward said he'd drink filtered water instead. He smelled the delicious meat and asked what meat it was. Lucas said beef, since goat meat smelled too strong and might make Edward vomit. After happily eating their fill, Edward passed Lucas the wine glass. Since Lucas currently didn't have any missions, would a little drinking be okay? Lucas finished the glass in one go. Edward was happy inwardly. Lucas's face was already red, so he adamantly told Edward no more drinking, and Edward agreed. Inwardly, Edward imagined what the night's scenes between them would be like. Calling Lucas, he saw Lucas was resting his chin with eyes closed. Thinking Lucas had fallen asleep, Edward waved his hand to check. Lucas woke up confused, asking what was going on. Edward asked if he was drunk, but Lucas denied it. Edward didn't know if it was Lucas's low alcohol tolerance or this place selling drugs. Since seeing Edward hold the wine bottle, Lucas thought Edward wanted him to drink more and quickly refused already. Edward said they ate quite a lot and should head back. Lucas must really be drunk, since usually he spoke very fluently instead of dragging out his speech to reply like now. They went to the cashier to pay, with Edward footing the bill today and Lucas blankly watching him. Outside, Lucas suddenly called Edward's name and held his hand out, wanting to hold Edward's hand too. Previously, he would always push Edward away, but now took the initiative to grasp Edward's hand, surprising him and making his face flushed red. Back at their rented place, Edward kept asking if Lucas was drunk, but Lucas denied it. Edward said he'd shower first, and Lucas hazily replied okay, then sat properly on the sofa, obediently waiting for Edward. After showering, Edward wore a pastel purple bathrobe while Lucas gazed at him. Blushing, Edward said Lucas should shower too. When Lucas stood up to go over, Edward breathed a sigh of relief. Edward took out the CD he bought from the restaurant and put it into the projector. Loud sounds suddenly came from it, and Edward panicked, not knowing how to lower the volume. He was flustered when Lucas came over from behind and pressed the volume down button. Edward looked back to see Lucas had discovered the disc, but he only casually asked if Edward liked cartoons. Confused, Edward thought no, the genre he bought wasn't that. He turned back to the screen. A cat was holding a birdcage. It turned out to be a cartoon Edward watched when young. Could the seller have tricked Edward? That stuff wouldn't have been so easy to buy, right? Lucas pulled Edward up from the cold floor over to the sofa, saying the floor was bad for him. Curious, Edward asked why Lucas didn't continue showering, realizing tonight's plans were ruined. Sounds still played from the TV, and Edward nonchalantly told Lucas to turn it off and rest early. At the same time, mating sound effects from the rabbits on screen started, shocking Edward and making him drop the remote control. As he regained himself and picked up the remote to switch it off, Lucas hugged him and stopped him because Lucas wanted to continue watching. Edward was even more shocked at the disc's content, but lied it was provided by the hotel. Lucas drew his face close to Edward's ear knowing he was lying, making Edward bashfully refute he didn't mean that. Now Edward noticed Lucas's breathing was a little chaotic. Lucas's body shook slightly as he felt Edward's chest. Edward shivered, calling Lucas affectionately. Lucas suddenly froze, explaining it was him instead of the old Lucas personality that Edward intimately called hubby. Edward wondered why Lucas had never touched him before, making Lucas turn away. Edward quickly said the doctor allowed it now, so why was Lucas still hesitating? He pulled Lucas closer. Their eyes met and breaths mingled sweetly. As the atmosphere heated up, Lucas couldn't hold back and wanted to carry Edward to bed. Edward brushed his leg against Lucas's thigh, hinting to not turn the lights off. Lucas caressed Edward's leg. Now if Edward asked anything, it seemed Lucas wouldn't refuse. Edward hugged Lucas, wanting him to kiss back. Lucas was surprised, asking who Edward called. Lying on the bed, Edward said if not Lucas then who else? Lucas looked satisfied. They started intimate gestures, Lucas kissing Edward's collarbone while Edward wondered if Lucas regretted not using protection when they had sex. Lucas refuted, saying it wasn't just once but twice. Confused, Edward made Lucas explain both times to him. The scene switches to the past at the interstellar base. Edward happily went to find Lucas but only received cold indifference. Yet Edward persisted, trying to seduce Lucas. That night, Edward took off his coat and hid naked under the bedsheets on Lucas's bed, waiting for him to return. Edward giggled, feeling accomplished. When Lucas opened the door and went straight to the bed, lifting the sheets, they stared at each other for a while. The next morning, Edward didn't have any impressions except a sore body. Looks like they passionately made love last night. Back to the present, Lucas sinisterly grinned, raising 3 fingers indicating it was 3 times, shocking Edward. Edward flipped over and Lucas lifted his shirt, slightly frowning at the words on Edward's back. Lucas seductively whispered in Edward's ear, making him jerk in surprise and quickly answer that he was Lucas's personal exclusive. Edward answered Lucas's barrage of questions, affirming Lucas was the one he had loved at first sight, despite Lucas treating Edward horribly back then. Edward's answers made Lucas smile blissfully as he hugged Edward, then gently kissed those petite lips of his. The next morning when Edward woke up, his whole body only felt soreness. He looked over at the beautifully sleeping Lucas. Suddenly Edward noticed Lucas's complexion seemed off, his face was drenched in sweat and he looked very uncomfortable. Edward was shocked, sitting straight up, calling Lucas, who was now clutching his old wound that started bleeding again. The ambulance siren rang out as Lucas was rushed to emergency care. Edward was very worried about him, but Lucas opened his eyes to reassure him that he was all right. The medics took Lucas to the emergency room while Edward stayed behind to speak with Lucas's assistant Fairy. Edward was still very concerned about Lucas's injury, which had bled a lot. Fairy calmly answered that Lucas had come here looking for Edward even when the injury was fresh. Edward sat down, clasping his hands, wondering if Lucas's injury was from the fight with Indira's men. Fairy pushed up his glasses and explained that Lucas had been hit in the stomach by a bio bullet because he rushed out without his bulletproof vest. Bio bullets were extremely dangerous weapons, carrying tissue-damaging microbes along with great destructive force. Edward broke out in a sweat, questioning how the injury still hadn't healed after 2 months. Fairy explained that Lucas hadn't received proper treatment in the past 2 months. They had brought him to the hospital for surgery, but Lucas stubbornly left to capture Indira's soldiers instead, nearly costing him his life. After being anesthetized at the hospital to prepare for surgery, Lucas rushed out upon hearing that Edward had been kidnapped. During this time, Lucas continuously searched for Edward without rest, working with the non-consortium to find Edward, his brother, and Mr. Chen. Fairy advised Edward not to impulsively leave Lucas's side again and to contact him right away when seeing the news. As Edward walked up the stairs, he told Fairy he didn't expect Lucas to go through so much effort. He didn't think what Lucas wanted to find was him. Fairy frowned, reminding Edward that gland number 6 was not easy to obtain. General Lucas had mobilized all his connections and resources day and night to assemble a research team. Fairy said everyone else rested while Lucas didn't even nap, only lying down for 2 hours when he couldn't carry on. This agonizing month wore out others while Lucas persisted. Edward was stunned that the search took so long. Fairy continued that Lucas completely neglected his injury this past month, refusing surgery and only taking medicine, leaving the wound unhealed. Edward covered his face, sobbing while blaming himself. He had thought Lucas could easily find him. Fairy comforted Edward not to blame himself too much, as that was Lucas's decision to prevent him from worrying excessively. Edward then worried whether drinking alcohol yesterday endangered Lucas's life. Fairy explained Lucas should avoid alcohol and strenuous activity with his injury. As Fairy stepped away to take a call and reassured Edward not to panic, Edward suddenly gripped his stomach in acute pain, unsure why. When Fairy returned to report Lucas was out of mortal danger, Edward tried to smile, but it was too much. Fortunately, Fairy rushed over to support him before he fainted. Edward awoke finding Lucas's grandmother beside his bed. She asked him to lie back down and handed him some food Fairy brought, saying Lucas's situation was stable with Fairy caring for him. After thanking her, Edward hastily asked Fairy for an update when connected. Fairy adjusted the visual to show the weakened Lucas lying unconscious in hospital. Edward stroked the screen asking when Lucas would wake up. After Fairy's reply, Lucas's grandmother urged Edward to rest and recover first before visiting. She gave him traditional medicine, advising him to care better for himself since he was no longer alone. That night as Edward slept, Lucas came in, sat down and stroked his face. Edward awoke with a start and Lucas turned on the light. Overjoyed to see it was really Lucas, Edward smiled broadly. Edward sat up wondering why Lucas wasn't resting and instead came here when he should be the one visiting. Lucas lifted his shirt to show Edward the wound and reassure him. Hesitantly, Edward reached out his hand which Lucas grasped and placed on his injury. Edward still wondered why Lucas didn't refuse the alcohol he offered, pretending to forget instead. He worried if Lucas should even be here since his wound was just stitched up a few hours ago, yet Lucas was unbothered. Lucas handed Edward the ultrasound scan praising how cute the baby was. Clasping his hands proudly, he said that was precisely when they conceived, so the child in Edward's belly was his too. Studying the scan, Edward recalled that back then Lucas still had his alternate personality, so the pregnancy could be that person's doing instead. Lucas gently touched Edward's stomach asking if he was unhappy it was Lucas's child. Blushing shyly, Edward stammered. Lucas tenderly pecked Edward's left eye. He recovered very quickly, discharged after just 3 days to care for Edward. Whereas they rarely used to be intimate, now they immersed themselves in boundless bliss. After work they would watch shows together. Lucas's change simultaneously surprised and overjoyed Edward, slowly melting away all his worries and doubts. Now Edward dared to actively express his affection. A week later, when Edward was finally discharged, Lucas enthusiastically pulled his suitcase, asking if he wanted to return to Lucas's home. Edward agreed since it was his elder's suggestion and he wanted to thank her. Reaching the car parked outside, Edward was stunned to recognize it as the one Lucas gifted him. As he touched it, Lucas asked if he liked this car. Edward happily said that with both of them sitting in it, what's not to like? Then a message notification sounded. Opening it, he found it was an order placed for his online handicraft shop. Lucas asked about it, so Edward explained his fondness for sewing and knitting prompted him to open the online store. Receiving his first international order excited him greatly. Self-consciously, he asked Lucas if it was shameful for him to have such interests. Lucas ruffled his hair, voicing his full support and even pride at his wife's endeavor. Edward reminisced about his previously extravagant yet wasteful lifestyle when wealthy. But now Edward wanted to develop his own career. As Lucas pinched his cheek encouragingly, Edward blinked confusedly with reddened cheeks. This gesture was exclusive to Lucas's other personality. Lucas withdrew his hand. Noticing Edward's fallen expression, he asked if something was wrong, which Edward denied with a shake of his head. Abruptly, Edward glanced back at Lucas, wondering if he truly had surgery to eliminate his alternate personality. Lucas also wondered why Edward was asking him these things. Edward waved it off, saying Lucas now truly resembled his other personality. Lucas explained he did have the surgery, but it was integration rather than elimination, surprising Edward. Lucas continued that unlike Indira's basic gene experiments, what affected him spawned the alternate persona. Lucas emphasized he was fundamentally incompatible with other species' genes, so he remained himself, causing Edward some unease. Although Edward claimed he didn't see Lucas as someone else, he actually thought the opposite, that only Lucas's induced personality truly cherished him wholeheartedly. Edward feared being treated coldly like before once that was erased, which was why he left. Seeing through Edward, Lucas stroked his face, explaining his two personas merely took different paths with different destinations. Like a professor lecturing, Lucas helped Edward understand his circumstances. Clasping his cheeks sadly, Edward listened as the smiling Lucas seemed to have won him over, rubbing his head affectionately while encouraging Edward to have more confidence and try his best. Finally, Edward realized Lucas also didn't accept himself and made wrong decisions out of fear of their marriage failing. Edward's heart thumped rapidly, still anxious that the induced personality's memories might be forgotten. but Lucas said the doctor told him they could return. Overjoyed, Edward eagerly listened as Lucas shared recovering some of those memories in his presence. Lucas shyly looked away as most were of Edward's childhood, surprising him. Darting his eyes at Edward, Lucas affirmed he could do the same things as his other self. Standing up clasping Edward's hand, Lucas bashfully knelt and tenderly called Edward liucong, nearly causing him to swoon. Kissing Edward's hand sincerely, Lucas pleaded for Edward never to leave him and stay by his side forever. The scene shifted to the grandmother's house which they had returned to. Looking around for her inside unsuccessfully, Edward figured she must be in her second-floor study. Lucas was amazed and Edward explained having visited previously to deliver a blue gemstone Lucas bought which he mistakenly thought was for his grandmother. Edward's sparkling eyes regarded Lucas saying the gem was meant for him. Lucas didn't deny it, simply smiling. Recalling refusing it then and upsetting Edward, Lucas acknowledged his mistake too. But Edward didn't blame him, gazing up and tiptoeing to passionately kiss Lucas right in his grandmother's foyer. Supported by her cane at the top of the stairs, she interrupted them with a loud cough. They promptly broke apart, faces averted. Edward solicitously asked after his elder's health. She beckoned him to assist her down. He immediately rushed over, but Lucas grasped his hand to stop him. Edward turned questioningly as Lucas said they should support her together. Hand in hand smiling at one another, they walked over to help the grandmother down, formally rescinding their divorce papers. Thus commenced their new honeymoon in marital bliss. In a luxurious room, Ethan Liu and Edward Chan were playing together. But when Edward fell, Ethan's father scolded and slapped his son. So Ethan greatly admired Edward for being loved by everyone. Afterwards, Ethan's father forced him to apologize to Edward, who accepted it. Ethan was a bit disappointed his father didn't stand up for him. Seeing this, Max Trin told Edward to play alone while he talked to Ethan. Max led Ethan upstairs. Originally unwilling, when Max playfully threatened to tell his father to scold him if he made a fuss, Ethan quieted down. Max put Ethan down, who wondered why he brought him here. Then Max took out a personal roll of bandage tape and dressed Ethan's injured hand. He asked if Edward grabbed and hurt him earlier, apologizing on his brother's behalf. Hearing this, Ethan blamed Edward for being silly to fall from a toy when Ethan only wanted to pull him back. Max gave Ethan a stuffed moose, hoping he'd forgive Edward. Initially refusing it disdainfully, when Max asked what he wanted instead, Ethan snatched up the moose, saying he'd reluctantly accept it. Witnessing this, Max felt Ethan was very cute, ruffling his hair. Ethan was deeply touched, for the first time feeling gently treated, affirmed and warmed by Max's sunshine. This sunshine planted a seed of love in little Ethan's heart. Over time it took root, sprouted branches and leaves, weathering bitterness to become a towering ancient tree. Max always hoped Edward and Ethan would marry someday. But one day Ethan nervously confessed to Max, who reacted with great surprise and awkwardness, asking if Ethan was joking after losing a dare. Hearing this, Ethan's expression fell and he angrily reaffirmed it was no game, he truly liked Max and wanted to keep him for himself. Ethan then pushed Max down into the chair, forcefully kissing him. Max pushed Ethan away, telling him not to do that. But after a moment, Max lowered his hand. Misinterpreting this as acceptance rather than avoiding embarrassment for Ethan, Ethan felt deeply hurt when Max stood up adjusting his clothes, saying to go home and that he'd treat today's events as a joke, not taking them to heart. But Ethan persistently explained he was very serious, that he really liked Max and wanted his attention and affection with eyes only for him. And Ethan wanted their relationship to become most intimate, for Max to be his life partner. Facing these words, Max regarded him with utmost coldness, saying he didn't like Ethan at all and hoped he would marry Edward instead. Hearing this, Ethan angrily cursed that only ghosts would like the useless Edward. He hated how Edward commanded all of Max's attention, could act coquettish with him freely, trampled on Ethan's feelings. Ethan declared the person he detested most in life was Edward Chin. Max immediately rebutted, forbidding Ethan from speaking of his brother that way. He told Ethan to go home and not come again. After venting frustration at Max a while, Ethan left dejectedly. Max then felt somewhat remorseful, fearing he was too harsh. He told himself this was all too overwhelming and he needed to calm down since their family's relations were hard to build and absolutely couldn't be damaged. Edward and Ethan's marriage was surely unchangeable. Given the circumstances, Max figured he should try his best to avoid seeing Ethan again. Max hastily went downstairs and inadvertently bumped into Edward. Teasing that he just saw someone, Max curiously asked who. Edward said he saw Ethan crying in the corner, probably after being rejected. Edward remembered Ethan's classmate said he planned to confess to someone. Edward asked if he should kindly comfort Ethan but then told Max to avoid Ethan for now. After running outside, Max felt some regret for provoking Ethan. When he found Ethan, Max tried to shield him with an umbrella but was initially brushed off. Recognizing it was Max, Ethan perked up only to be coldly told to swiftly go home. As Max turned to leave, Ethan grabbed him, causing Max to drop the umbrella. Because he was suddenly pulled back without any precautions, Max Trin groaned a few times. He felt very confused about Ethan Lu, but when he looked up and saw him crying, Max was even more confused, so he